Hey, this is Rob Bertholf and another in the series of the Pathway track. And this course is covering love and marriage. Whether I'm the best or the worst person to give this advice, for me, it's mostly nothing in here is my advice. It's just mostly scriptures that I've found as I was researching for myself. And so I'll be covering what I'd found researching preparation for marriage, into courtship, what to think about before engagement, before marriage, and then after marriage. When we look in preparation, the pathway to marriage requires a lot of it, right? So this module, we're going to cover a few different ways of thinking. It's really a lot about mindset. The first one's going to be self-awareness. And one of the most important first steps is developing self-awareness. And self-awareness is essentially just being aware of what you're typically not aware of. So it's about thinking about the unknown of yourself, understanding how you fit into an environment, your impact on others, as well as the impact that others may have had on you. And as we think through this, I highly recommend my course on personal branding, because I have covered a lot of different areas about how to remove blind spots. And so I highly recommend that course to kind of dive deeper in this topic. But at a high level, I want to kind of start with this concept of, understanding your love language, understanding what it is that you're looking for, what your needs are. And I highly recommend this book by Gary Chapman. In this book, he kind of defines these 5 desires. And so there's physical touch, words of affirmation, acts of service, quality time, and receiving gifts. And the basic understanding is that when you know your love language, or more interesting, the love language of the person you want to interact with, you can ensure that your efforts are not wasted. So if you speak to them in a way that they value, then it's going to have a much higher impact for them. So I recommend this exercise not only for romantic relationships, but also understanding how to reward professional interactions. And again, I go much more in detail in the other course. But the takeaway is simply this. If you know what your love language is, you'll understand what you were deficient is as a child. Now, they never mention this in the book, but that's really what it comes down to. Now, this is a gross oversimplification, but what I'm trying to explore is just how impactful really our childhoods are and how we carry those, ultimately our childhood experiences, into adulthood. I recommend watching this video. It's called The Only Subject You Really Need to Study, Your Own Childhood. And in this video, you learn kind of how impactful that programming period is. And this kind of unstudied subject, being our childhood, gives us an opportunity or a way to kind of see through and give us a greater chance of living a full and engaged life, dependent on understanding what our early programming was. Now, granted, even though understanding this, taking this and healing and asking for forgiveness for things, forgiving for things, and then ultimately going to God to have Him heal us as the only source of healing. But I do believe that it's a very powerful exercise and a powerful thing to be thinking through. I use this analogy a lot, but it's this concept that, imagine humans as orbs, right? So imagine your child self as an orb. And as a child, this very young orb, it's very soft. It doesn't have a very hard outer shell. It's got very gelatinous inner filling. And other orbs can easily send spikes and wound this young orb, because these other orbs, if they say if they do an action or they say a word, it can actually wound really deep because there's no protection layer on that. Now, over time, our orb develops this thick outer layer, and then it helps fend these spikes, these attacks from other orbs. But knowing that the indentations, even from earlier wounds, still remain, and so the wounds start to scab over, but they're not really healed. And they never actually fully heal unless we forgive them out. And if we don't forgive them out, then these wounds stay with us throughout our entire life. And this allows then, these wounds, a hole, an area where there's been an indentation that we never forgave, that actually ultimately makes it easier for this type of, for another orb to wound you. Right? So the idea is, if you've never actually forgiven and never actually asked for God to really heal you in that area, another orb, another person, can actually just poke right through to a place that you've been hurt earlier. And so we often call this triggers, right? We say, oh, I'm being triggered right now. I don't know why I'm so upset about this, but I am. It's because they've reached, we say they reached a nerve, but the reason they were able to access that nerve directly is because you still have an open wound there. So now let's imagine humans as an orb, but now imagine that they also contain cylinders. So we have inside of us these kind of areas, right? And these areas are, areas that say, physical touch, gifts, quality time, acts of service, words of affirmation. So ultimately, each of these love languages are a cylinder inside of our orb. And when we realize that those spikes that damaged us as an early child are ultimately puncturing, and creating holes in our cylinders, that will explain very easily why we even have deficiencies. Why is someone's love language physical touch or quality time or whatever it would be? It's because that was wounded as a child. You didn't get that as a child, and so it has holes in it. And while God continues to pour healing into us, because we haven't forgiven out, because we haven't healed emotionally, those cylinders have holes in them, and it just leaks out. And so we're still deficient in quality time, or deficient, let's say, in physical touch, because it was something that still needs to be healed. So ultimately what this comes down to is doing work on yourself, confronting your pain. And before we actually should be even qualified to enter into a relationship, we really need to be ready, and we need to confront our pain and make sure that we're not taking things into a relationship that will set it up for failure. Benjamin Franklin was quoted as saying, "Those things that hurt instruct." And this idea is that through confronting and resolving problems is when we learn, and if we can learn, we can help others to avoid the same pain that we went through. So the takeaway ultimately is, again, do homework on your hardships. And this means really analyze the struggles you went through and forgive those who hurt you. Then pray to God that God helps you overcome this pain that you have, so that you can be in a position to help others with the same pain. So I recommend that you actually do this exercise, think through. I challenge you to, really be open and honest with yourself and think, what is my pain? And if you're not sure, then maybe think about, what are some things recently that have disturbed me? What are some things that somebody said something and it really bothered me, or they did this or they didn't do this and it bothered me? And then think through, what's the reason below that? With my mentees, I always talk about nothing is surface level. I don't care about surface level things because they don't actually matter. So let's go to the root of this, right? Go deeper. What's the underlying root cause of why that surface level thing bothered you? And where does that come from? And ultimately what we're able to do is, and I call this pulling the thread with my mentees, but this idea of unraveling our emotions and going through, and especially when we're talking about how we deal with others, and really diving into, I guess, the chain reaction, so to speak, right? So in this instance, it's helpful if we lash out or if we continue with an action that doesn't serve us. Let's dive in and figure out why. Like, why do we repeat patterns? What are our triggers? And then dive into those and really get to the core so we can heal. And this guide kind of helps others with the same trigger find healing that we obviously only comes from God. But seeing how this level works. There's surface level emotion, actions that are done by an emotion. There's some sort of motivator, and that's typically due to some child trauma. That results in an impact, which is a trigger that then goes back to why our surface level action existed. So when you can see this whole cycle and you can see why this happens, you'll be able to then put a stop to it and ultimately be healthier going into a relationship. So next, I recommend confronting your challenges. And it's important to, again, be honest with yourself. What are you, ultimately failing, and ask God to intervene, right? Like, what are you failing at? What's a recent temptation that you failed? What are some frequently temptations that you keep failing over and over? Or what was a temptation that you had for a really long time that you were failing and maybe have gained God has given you victory over? The idea here again is think about, what am I carrying into the relationship, right? Do I have problems with envy, with lying, with stealing, pornography, drugs, alcohol, gambling, whatever that vice is, even just being unhappy, right? Figure out why. And so when you then have really analyzed this and become more self-aware, and you're being honest with yourself of what baggage you're bringing into a relationship, you'll think about the things that maybe need to be resolved first. And maybe God has kept you single as an opportunity for you to get right with God and really work on these things, because they don't get easier going into a relationship. In fact, they actually get harder. So if you can heal your way through with God's help, before going into a relationship, I think you'll end up finding out that you'll have a much easier time on your side. And as later on, we'll be thinking about the same thing on the other side with your partner. But that's that idea, though, of, is there this equality? Is there a parity between you and that partner that you may be thinking of wanting to start a relationship with? And this really is the next topic, right? This leads to this idea of, what does it mean to be equally yoked? And to me, the image says it all, right? How do we move forward if our partner's given up? And is this idea that in marriage we will be yoked to another person, right? And we ultimately have to figure out, will they slow us down, or will they bring us closer to God and the mission God has for us? So, that said, I think that the idea of marriage is, to lift each other up when we fall down. So, if our partner falls down like that last picture, I think that's, it's normal and it's expected, but we are there to lift them up. But ultimately, it comes down to, if the core values are different and they just have no desire to be lifted up, not like a temporary struggle, not like, hey, I'm having a bad day or a bad week even, but just generally, I don't really have a desire to embody the fruits of the Spirit. So ultimately, if your core values are different, then there really is no path forward, right? Because understanding, again, that everything here is temporary. We're going to talk about this a lot, but we need to be thinking through the bigger vision is that we are to be co-laborers with God, and we are to be yoked with God. So if we're yoked with God and also with somebody here on earth, and that person here on earth is not yoked with God, then are we actually able to achieve what God has instructed us to achieve? Right? We're not here on earth to serve self. We're here to serve God by serving others. And so thinking through this, it's important, this is why we read in 2 Corinthians 6:14 that we're told very clearly we are not to be unequally yoked with other unbelievers. And the reason, again, is because it will stop us from the mission that God has for us. In the Spirit of Prophecy, we read, great care should be taken by Christian youth in the formation of friendships and the choice of companions. Marriage between unbelievers and believers is forbidden by God. Very clearly forbidden. So if you're not to be married, then you're not to entertain even an idea of dating somebody, right? So if we're not going to, we shouldn't even think about dating outside of our faith, because it's ultimately not going to be leading someone to God. That said, just because someone shows up to the same church as you do does not mean that you have the same values. And so it goes further than just thinking about, do we go to the same church? It's really a lot further than that. So again, thinking through our mindset, how we go into relationship, and how this can be clouded. And there's a few ways we have to be mindful of. So first, the Bible the Adventist manual tells us, and the Bible also does as well, but this idea that God intended marriage to be permanent. And the analogy is that it's like Christ's relationship with the church. It's a permanent relationship. So going into a marriage, their mindset needs to be, one, that this is a permanent venture. It's a permanent arrangement. The second is, throughout, we need to ensure that our mind is focused on the heavenly, not the earthly. We must remember that earth is just going to fade away soon, and all that will remain is eternal life. And when we look at even 100 years or even 120 years, that the longest that man can live, compared to eternity, is actually just very, 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 very just a blip. And so this is just going to be, if we make decisions on earth that stop us from getting to heaven, that is why it's so important to pick the right partners. We remember the parable of the wise and foolish builder that we read in Matthew 7 about how one man built his house on a rock, and because it was founded on a rock, it never fell. But another founded it on the sand, and the winds and the floods came, and it just disappeared. And so this is a really kind of an analogy, Christ being the rock. So if we're not right with God, we haven't built our foundation on God, going into a relationship, we may not come out of it still founded on God. And so again, relationships with God, are individual, right? Personal connections, right? This, our partner cannot give us a relationship with God. They can't make it easier for us. They can make it easier for us to stay with God with their good habits, but ultimately we have to have a personal relationship with Jesus. So we have to ask ourselves, are we really founded on the rock? Have we connected, to God? Does God ultimately, wish for us to connect with Him more before taking on new influences? Right? I believe so. Right? We can't found our faith on our partner's faith. We must have that relationship with God directly. And sometimes we wonder why we can't find a partner, and it could just be again that we need to first firmly be planted our feet on God's as our rock, as our foundation first. And that way, when we get brought into the world, so to speak, this partner won't be able to distract us away from God. In this analogy, kind of God being the church, and we're to be married to God. And so, any earthly partner that takes us away from our mission to God is a distraction. And so we really need to be clear about going into all of this. Hebrews reminds us that this world is not our permanent home, right? We are looking forward to a home yet to come. And we need to be focused on that heavenly home. Again, all of this focus on partnerships and marriage, it's we'll get into this more in a little bit, but it's really focused around, will this allow me to, continue to focus on God, be able to achieve the mission He has for me, and can I find somebody that I'm joint in a mission with? Whenever we think about relationships, we need to make sure that we don't get lost. We have to stay focused on our purpose. We are all given a gift. And that gift is a mission. 1 Corinthians 7:7, that every man hath his proper gift from God. So what that means is that God has given us a mission, and it's important that you think and pray and actually understand what is the mission that God gave you to do. And by taking on somebody who, as a partner who maybe really wants to travel, and they want to have kids, and they want to go on all these different things, and they want to be part of the world, does that align with the mission that God gave you? And in some instances, in weird instances, it may, right? Because God has given each of us unique missions. There isn't some one size fits all. And ultimately, there's no answer to any of this other than just go to God and understand what He has to say. But reading later in 1 Corinthians in verse 32, we read that we are to attend upon the Lord without distraction, right? So we need to be fully focused, especially in this day and age. We need to be fully focused on the mission God gave us and not allow things to distract us. So the question becomes, will we be hindered by our partner and their earthly desires? What is our potential partner's focus? Is it a mission, or is it living up to the standards of the world, right? What's the most important things to them? Is it God or things of this world? If they really want to live in town, have a fancy car, and chase the cash, or are they really saying, look, mission is the most important. If we're, God will always take care of us. Let's not worry about, chasing the earthly desires. Let's be truthful, be faithful to God. That's the type of partner, ultimately, I believe, to go after. God is preparing a people. God's people must not only know His will, but they must practice it. Many will be purged out from the numbers of those who know the truth because they're not sanctified by it. This is referring to the shaking. The truth must be brought into their hearts, sanctifying and cleansing them from all earthliness and sensuality in the most private life. The soul temple must be cleansed, every secret act as if it were the presence of God and in the holy angels, as if all things are open before God, and from him nothing can be hid. God is purifying a people to have clean hands and pure hearts to stand before him in the judgment. The standard must be elevated, the imagination purified, the infatuation clustered around debasing practices must be given up, and the soul uplifted to pure thoughts and holy practices. All who stand the test and trial just before us will be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped and not participated in the corruptions that are in the world through lust. So my recommendation is from this, the takeaway is discuss and pray for God to impress the mission ultimately for your marriage. And ultimately going back to this concept of, understanding what you believe God's mission is for you and finding people that align around that mission or that can help support that mission and at a minimum do not deter from that mission. And sometimes people say, well, I've got to be with this person because, they're my soulmate. And so sometimes we get wrapped up in this temporal emotions and we use those as an excuse to focus on this life because, we found true love. But, ultimately, what is true love? And some people have, grown up watching Disney movies and believe that, Prince Charming is going to sweep them off their feet. But fairy tales don't exist. All of that is ultimately, I believe, a deception. And, look, I was raised, when I was a kid, I was a hopeless romantic. And, there still is that part in me, but that's sentimentalism. And it doesn't necessarily, you can't root yourself in that, right? Root yourself in God's plans because they're even bigger than a fairy tale. Don't just, go in with expectations of what's sold to us through the media, right? We should strive for a level-headed and practical relationships where we're paired with others that want to do the will of God. Matthew 22:30 reads that when Jesus comes, we are not to be married, right? We're not going to be married when Jesus comes. After he comes and we're resurrected, there's neither marriage nor given in marriage, right? So if this true love based on Hollywood standards was a real thing and it was of God, then there was just one person, and they're our soulmate and all this stuff, but then we would still be married in heaven with them. But it's not the case. So if we see that there is no marriage in heaven, we realize that there is no such thing as a soulmate here on earth, and ultimately it becomes much more of a practical relationships. And I'm not wanting to take the beauty of relationships away. It's more along the lines of understanding what really true love is. So true love is ultimately not a bunch of sentimentalist soulmate stuff. And while I believe God gives us beautiful emotions when you're in the right partnership that God approves of, but when we really read into it, true love is a principle, right? The Spirit of Prophecy states that true love is a high and holy principle, and that love which is awakened by impulse dies when severely tested. So if we're driven by lust, if we're driven by, sentimentalism, when that's tested, it'll actually die away. Anything that's not formed and founded on the rock will die away. We continue that love is not a strong, impetuous passion. Instead, it's calm and looks beyond the externals. Its devotion is real and abiding. If you're looking to make a decision between different partners, and one of them, really does it for you, and really kind of makes you warm inside, and the other one is you're less excited about, but it feels like, wow, you know what? This person's really guided by God, and I really think that we could do amazing things together. My advice is you'll find the truest happiness long term by going after the more practical, I guess, and, mission-driven relationships. Not to say that there's not going to be attraction, all of this. There definitely has to be there. But God gives you that. God gives you that everything that you need to have a wonderful marriage. And the idea is simply that, don't chase after passions and lust, because throughout the Bible, if we are driven by lustful thoughts, then we see that there's pretty dire consequences from that. So again, pure and holy affection is not a feeling, but a principle. We read it further here. Pure love will take God into all its plans. Modesty, simplicity, sincerity, morality, and religion will characterize every step towards an allegiance in marriage. If those are not your pathways, if those are not the steps that you're looking at, and you're intrigued by somebody who's immodest, if you're intrigued by somebody who is very complicated and a lot of different things just all over the place, if you're intrigued by somebody who is insincere and doesn't take their words seriously and is just kind of joking all the time, and maybe does these kind of puts you down a little bit as a way to kind of lift themselves up, right? If they are immoral in any way, or if they're not completely devoted to God, then there's no path forward with them. Wait till they grow up or move on, but don't engage with them. Again, we must familiarize ourselves with what God describes as true love and realize that it's not passion or lust. Really think through what God's desire is in the union of a marriage. And, in early, the beginning of the world, God said, be fruitful and multiply. But is that still the message that God has for us? Is the message still, hey, get married and create a bunch of kids? Or is the message a little bit different? Do we believe that we're in the final generation is a question you need to ask yourself, and also a question that you should ask any potential partners. Make sure that you align on what age we're living in. And then maybe the question is, should we even be thinking about marriage anymore? Now, I recommend that if you haven't already, take my class on pattern matching in my theological course on pattern matching time. This one will lay out a biblical narrative that shows that we are in the 11th hour. We are literally in God's time, minutes before he leaves and comes back here. So with that, the question really comes into, understanding that we're told that there's a season for everything. And, the question is, are we past the season of marriage? Is marriage even viable anymore? And Ellen White says, she was quoted that in the last time, in the last days of world's history, which she was in her time, and then because of rejecting the message of 1888, we're now the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and so now we're in the fifth generation, the final generation. In the last days of world history, marriage are taking place, and the Adventist Church has never forbidden marriage. So she says it's a case-by-case basis, and you need to go to the Word of God. So what does God say? Genesis 2:18, right, reads, "It is not good for man to be alone. I'll make him a helpmeet." Okay, so, 1 point towards marriage. Proverbs 18:22, "Whosoever findeth a wife is a good thing and obtaineth favor of the Lord." Okay, 2 points for marriage. Psalm 68:6, we read that God sets the solitary in families. So does this show that God knows that we are, social beings, and he wants to put us in places that we can be encouraged and supported? I believe so. So this could be point 3 for marriage. This also could mean, just finding communities of people that can uplift and support. And that's something I'm really interested in, is developing ultimately communities of people that can just uplift and support each other, even kind of like one big extended family. In 1 Corinthians states that marriage is a vehicle to those that have not been given the gift of celibacy, and that marriage keeps us from fornication. So it also warns in the same one that you shall have trouble in the flesh. So it warns that marriage will have new challenges. But we can still say, another point towards marriage, right? We say, earlier in Corinthians, It's a little more blunt. It's better to marry than burn. Okay, I guess that's another point for marriage. Better, this idea of if we have not been, if we're not able to overcome these desires for intimacy or desires for affection, then, it's better that we seek those in a relationship, right? In a marriage that can be sanctified, than commit fornication. So that's, again, that fifth point for marriage. Psalms 84:11 says, it actually promises us that no good thing will he keep from us. So God will not hold anything that is good from us, right? So when we look at that, we can go to Matthew now, 6:33, and see, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then all these things will be added unto you. So we are to seek first the relationship of God and form a relationship with Jesus, and then, only then, we can have a relationship will be added unto us. Right? Again, it's this idea of, until we've built ourselves on the rock, how can we, add a duplex? Right? We need to be firmly on the rock first. We need to remember our purpose. We need to recognize that we are in the final generation and that we have a special role to play. Right? 1 Peter 2:9. But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. Right? So this is kind of a point towards singleness, right? An idea that we should not let anything impact really us maintaining this state or achieving this state, right? So Psalms 119 says, with my whole heart I have sought thee, right? We're to seek after Jesus with our entire heart. And so that's another point for singleness, right? This idea that we shouldn't be focused on anything else. We're to be sober-minded. This means not completely wrapped around some girl or some boy, all you can do is think about them. No, we are to be sober-minded. We are to understand the times. We are to understand our mission. So point 3 for singleness. We must present ourselves acceptable unto God. We are to be a living sacrifice. Right? So this is an interesting statement that, our bodies need to be pure. They need to be a living sacrifice. And that can mean a number of different things, right? We look into 1 Corinthians 6:19, that our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So we are not our own. We are here for a purpose when we actually find out that God has placed us here ultimately to end this world. This generation is here to reach a state that God can leave the Holy of Holies and come to earth and claim us as his own. But we can't do that without a mediator, right? Until we reach a state of sinlessness. And that was the message in 1888. It's the message today. So if we are thinking about a relationship, it can only be along the lines, in my opinion, it must be along the lines of, am I getting a sin sobriety partner? Am I getting somebody who wants to pray for me and lift me up? Am I having somebody that I can pray for and lift up? And ultimately, do we have the same thing in mind? Or am I giving my wife to God? Is my wife giving me to God? Right? Is she pointing herself directly to God? And the man is to be the head of the household and the wife underneath him. But that doesn't stop the relationship from her. I would rather her be directly underneath God and have a direct relationship to God. I don't want to own anyone, and I think that God needs to own everyone. But it's more about for me, like a tiebreaker kind of thing. So if there's an argument, I think it goes ultimately to prayer. But if there is no guidance on that, it's just a tiebreaker. It should go to the man, because that whole apple thing back in the day. Anyway, actually, it wasn't even an apple. It doesn't say it was an apple. So it just fruit thing. Okay, that's somewhat joking, somewhat not. The point is this: Paul understood the mission. He remained single, and he encouraged that the unmarried and the widows also remain single, right? But that means a single-minded focus on God. If you can find the right partner, okay, if God gives you the right partner that allows you to maintain a single focus on God, then it's a blessing, right? The bigger narrative here is, if you find the right partner, you are no longer going to be able to do the will of God. If they want to spend every second with you and you guys want to just watch Netflix all day long, then ultimately it was better if you stayed single and focused on ministry. In Matthew 19:11, Jesus himself breaks the tie, right? It was marriage 4, singleness 4, and Jesus breaks the tie with, there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this, the one who can do it, should accept it, right? So Jesus encouraged those that could remain single to remain single. And again, I believe that this is really focused around this idea of not getting wrapped into marriage. I don't think it's a rebuke of marriage by any means. God said, man should not be alone. God blesses weddings. In fact, Jesus' first miracle was at a wedding. Jesus loves weddings. I think the bigger picture here is, you've got to be really clear that when you engage in this relationship, that you're not going to be taken away from Jesus, right? Ellen White in 1885 wrote, in the age of the world, as the scenes of earth history are soon to close, we are about to enter upon a time of trouble. Such never was. The fewer marriages contracted, the better for all. That's a pretty, direct statement there. Again, going into when the time of trouble comes, if the person that you've picked out, hopefully God picked it out for you, the person that you're aligned with, if they have not given their heart to Christ, they're ultimately, going to be shaken out. And it's going to be incredibly hard for you if your partner, somebody that you really, really love, is going astray because you may just follow them. 1 Corinthians 7:32-35 says, he that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord. And ultimately is this kind of concept that if anyone that's unmarried cares for things related to God only, single-minded, single-focused. And those who are married try to kind of please each other, and they now have ultimately more complexities to deal with. Right now, you got to deal with your spouse, making sure that she's happy, and maybe that conflicts with your spiritual time. Right? Maybe they want to stay up late and goes past the time that you want to read, or maybe you want to wake up and read, and they want to wake up and just go straight into talking or play music or do the other things. Right? You need to make sure that you are completely aligned before choosing a spouse. Matthew 6:24 reminds us that we cannot serve two masters. We can't serve God and man, right? So you can't serve your husband or you can't serve your wife and God at the same time unless you choose to serve God first, both of you, and then ultimately live a kind of a path together, right? You're walking together towards God, but you're not so wrapped up into a relationship where they can pull you away from God. Now, again, this does not mean that we're destined to be lonely, right? This is just to say that marriage is not a decision of your own. You've got to go to God and see what his plan is for you. Throughout the Bible, God has selected people like Jeremiah the prophet, who was to fill a prophetic role and needed to do that without any distractions. And so God instructed him not to marry or have kids, not to go to funerals, not to go to parties, right? And this is an example where there are edge cases where God actually does not want you to marry. It doesn't mean everybody, right? But even Jeremiah, right, said that he believed that nothing was too hard for God. If his life was to fill a prophetic role without distractions, and he said that nothing was too hard for God. So if God has a plan for your life, he'll give you the strength and the peace to live it out. There are a number of lessons we can take from Jeremiah. One, he was chosen by God for a specific purpose, yet he looked past this world into the eternal. He accepted the role of placing God first and trusted that God was in control. And so the question becomes, do you know God's plans for you? Right? We've got to have that relationship with God first, and he will show you his plans. God loves to share his plans. Right? And so, again, if you are getting into a relationship before you know your plans, and then you find out your plans, do they actually align, and will your partner hold you back? There are some instances in the Bible where, virgins were used to give messages and prophesied through. So there again are more edge cases in the Bible where maintaining purity and not getting married and being fully devoted to God was something that God looked on and was able to use people in different roles. Some take this further and they read Revelation 14:4 to say that the 144,000 will be virgins. But I believe this is clearly not literal. Otherwise, it would mean that only men could actually be in the 144,000. What I believe this actually means is not to be defiled by women. Women means church in the Bible, figuratively. So there will be those who are in the church of God, and the only way to stay in the church through the shaking is by laying hold on the righteousness by faith. So again, don't get too caught up in this concept of needing to be a virgin to be in the 144,000 or needing to be a virgin to be used by God. There are plenty of instances where God used people in a mighty way who were in a relationship. What is clear to me is this: God has individual plans for each one of us. We're not given all the same mission. And I believe that some of us, God desires that we don't actually marry and that we are to stay focused fully on a relationship with Jesus. We've seen that through the Bible. But I also believe that God won't test us above what we're able. And if he sees that we're not able to avoid temptation, he gives us a partner, right? But that partner must be perfectly aligned, not to hinder our purpose and mission in any way. The only way to find the perfect pairing is through God's leading. And if we make decisions on our own part, it's just better we stayed single. Also, a little bit of irony here, but Proverbs 21:19, Solomon had a lot of wives, and so he told you that it's better to dwell in the wilderness than to be with a contentious and angry woman. So you can put this in a more general way. Just listen to Solomon. He knows marriage, or he knows wives and partnerships. And he says it's better to stay single than to be with an angry spouse. So a little bit of joking, a lot about not about joking. But the takeaway is this: let our prayer be that God impresses upon our hearts and impresses his will for you, and then trust that he wants the best in your life. And if you're single, trust that he wants you there for that time. If you're in the process of if you believe God gave you somebody and has brought them into your life, then just look into this and say, okay, is this actually best for my eternal being? Is this best for the mission that God gave me here on earth? If the answer to those are yes, then move forward with courtship, right? If God is leading you, then let's look at what the Spirit of Prophecy says about courtship. So during courtship, we're told that modesty, simplicity, sincerity, morality, and religion, right? Remember this verse from earlier? This is something that is a great foundation, that will be in perfect harmony with the Spirit of God. She writes that imagination, lovesick sentimentalism, and should be guarded against like it were leprosy. Okay, so the idea is that when you kind of enter into a relationship, don't get lost in gaga land. Really stay objective and ensure that everything is moving forward as God would intend. When you're, drawn to them, remember that the habit of staying up late is not pleasing to God. Even if you're both Christians, it hurts your health, it makes your mind unfit for the next day's duties, and it can have the appearance of evil. So the next thing to think about also is, it reads, night after night, these young people burn the midnight oil to talk with each other. But in reference of subjects of serious and solemn interest? No, rather of frivolous things with no importance. Time is short, and we really need to make sure that our time is focused and we're not distracted by things that are irrelevant. So one of the things that I did was enacted a phone call curfew when we were apart of, hey, we're not going to talk to each other after 10 or before 5, because I just wanted to talk all night long. And then we're cautious of how much ultimately ensure we didn't have some sort of too much just babbling going on. and making sure that, is this focused conversations? Are we actually getting to know each other? Are we diving deeper than just the surface stuff? Are we actually learning about each other and taking the time to ensure that we actually know who the partner really is, versus just talk a bunch of stuff at their surface, and then you get into a relationship, you find out that they're completely not who you had in mind, that you had projected yourself on them, and instead of actually learning who they actually were. The next thing that we're warned about is maintaining individuality. Now, new couples often seek to just merge together, but the spirit of prophecy says that while you two are to blend as one, neither of you is to lose their individuality in the other. Right? God is the owner of our individuality. So I recommend going through and taking an inventory, thinking about what are the things that God's instilled in you that make you unique, right? Cross off anything that you think is not really given to you to be prepared for heavenly work, and cross off any traits that you believe are against the fruit of the Spirit. But make this list and really think about these things which you feel like that bring you closer to God. These things should not be compromised in your relationship on earth, right? So if you are generous by nature, God gave you generosity, maybe don't find somebody who completely limits your generosity or your willingness to serve or your desire, for cleanliness or whatever it is that you feel like these are good traits. See if your partner will acclimate up to that. So again, if someone's writing down like, well, I want to be independent, and I see this a lot, right? People say, well, I want to be independent, but I don't believe that independence and relationship go together, right? Find a partner that's your best friend. Otherwise, why get married, right? If you're only getting married to, just to have someone to have intercourse with and then go back and live your life again, then maybe you weren't prepared to be in a relationship in the first place. The next thing is think about what are the ways that you express the love of God through you and the creativity that God gives through you. So think about these activities, right? And maybe it's going to be like singing or being in nature or painting or whatever it is. These are traits, these are activities that you should ensure are not lost in your new partner. If you feel that singing is the thing that brings you closest to God, and then you get into a relationship and they don't like singing, then maybe that's not a good relationship to be in. You don't want to lose the gifts that God gave you is really the ultimate piece here. So again, really thinking through, are you aligned? And there's so much more to this. Honestly, like this course could have gone on indefinitely as you could dive deeper and deeper and deeper into things, understanding patterns, lifestyle patterns, etc. But ultimately, those are some things that you should be thinking about before ever thinking about moving forward. If you feel like all that aligns, before you even think about engagement, right? Now think through the next level. So one's before dating, and now before you would think about getting engaged, as you're dating somebody, think through what are the implications potentially of marrying this person. And we read that every marriage engagement should be carefully considered, for the marriage is a step taken for life. Okay. Both men and women should carefully consider whether they cleave to each other through life as long as they both shall live. So ultimately, is this something that's going to last? And is there a foundation to last? Let every step towards marriage alliance be characterized by modesty, simplicity, sincerity, and the earnest purpose to please and honor God. Marriage affects the afterlife, both in this world and the world to come. In several ways, I believe, but in the most important way right now is if you are unequally yoked and you end up loving them more than you love God, they can actually steal you from going into heaven. Jesus has purchased you with his own life, and you belong to him. Therefore, he is to be consulted on all things. We need to make sure that every step of the way, you're asking God if that's his desire for you. A sincere Christian will not advance his plans in this direction without the knowledge that God approves this course. If men and women are in the habit of praying twice a day before contemplating marriage, they should pray 4 or 5 times a day. So this idea that we need to ultimately understand the implications of marriage and then double the amount of prayer time, asking Jesus to be part of that decision. Again, when you're thinking through this, asking, is God glorified by this relationship? This needs to be at the front of our mind at all times. Those who profess to be Christians should never enter in a marriage relation until the matter has been carefully and prayerfully considered from an elevated standpoint. Okay? Sanctified principles should be the basis of every action. It's important to discuss also every privilege of the marriage relation. So this includes what are your spiritual desires, what are your emotional needs, physical expectations, and financial expectations. All of this needs to be discussed. Even the things that you kind of want to shy away from, right? Don't engage further in a relationship until you've had these tougher conversations. There are relationships that are drive you further from God if you are disaligned spiritually. There are relationships that are not fulfilling if you have an emotional disconnect. We've seen marriages be lost over no alignment on the physical expectations, and we've seen one of the largest issues with marriages is financial. And so having a very clear understanding of all these areas and setting expectations is one of the first things to think about. Expectations in everything that you do is important. So what are some expectations that came out of that previous exercise that you've done, right? What comes out of this? Are these expectations in alignment with God's will for you? Do you believe that what your partner has said is their expectations will bring you closer or further from God? Now, from there, go deeper into the small things, right? I believe that this is one of the most critical steps is aligning expectations around the daily routine and this overall lifestyle, right? What are the expectations? When you go to bed, when do you wake up, what do you eat? Are you in alignment with these things, right? How many times a day do you eat? What do you eat? Are you vegan? Are you vegetarian? What are your deal breakers? Do you eating sugar? Are you, think really through, is this the partner that is ready? Will they be dragging me down? Am I strong enough to bring them up, right? And that's another piece is, do you feel that you're going to be brought down, or do you feel that you can bring them up? And we must analyze and realize that no matter how evenly yoked in the big picture we are, there's always going to be areas where you may be closer to God or God's will for you and then your partner. And in other instances, you may be closer, but your partner may be further away. So the question is, are you, willing to ultimately acclimate to your partner's good choices? And are they willing to surrender to God in choices that God has impressed upon you? And finally, there's areas that maybe both of you need improvement on. And, do you have the resolve to really pray for the Holy Spirit and listen for the Holy Spirit to help move you closer to where God wants you to be? If the answer is no to any of these, then probably take a step back. What is important is not having someone to snuggle with. What is important is going closer to God. So God will fill you with the desires of his heart, with the desires of your heart. God will take care of you, there's no question. But you've got to always put God first. The takeaway is discuss your daily routine, discuss diet choices, discuss what media you're going to have, right? What are the deal breakers in this? What are you saying? Look, I don't want ever, so for me, I didn't want to ever have any worldly music. I don't want the TV. I don't even want to own a TV, okay? Those are things that are deal breakers for me. Think through these things and make hard choices. And even if you find Mr. Dreamy or Mrs. Hottie, whatever it would be, then, if they don't align with these choices that you've decided to make and a lifestyle that will point you closer to God, walk away. The next is to understand what traditions that your partner may hold on to. And this is stuff that, typically, it's only once a year. It's not a big deal. It just kind of comes up later in the relationship. Talk through it now, right? What are some family traditions? Do you take vacations? What are your expectations of not what your day-to-day life looks like, but now your annual life looks like, right? Which holidays and festivals do they want to celebrate, right? What's important to them? And a lot of these things are rooted, obviously, in tradition, right? It's rooted in, I've always did this when I was growing up, and even though it's a pagan holiday, I really like it, right? Uncover these things early on. The most important one to uncover is what's their definition of Sabbath keeping, and is that in alignment with what God wants? Are they wanting to learn and continue to grow and more closely to what God has in mind for the Sabbath? Next, think through what are the family expectations, right? So does their understanding of family align with your understanding? This is going to be things like who will live with you. You want to find out early if their mom's going to live with you or whatever it's going to be, right? Make sure you're okay with these things. Who's going to be, are we going to be financially supporting other family members? What about children, right? Ellen White says that before increasing the family, they should take into consideration whether God would be glorified or dishonored by bringing children into the world. This ties into a lot of other things. Things like, do you have a history of family illness? Things like this. Consider whether their offspring will possess physical health and mental and moral strength, right? So again, this goes into few have moved with high motives and elevated their considerations, which they could not lightly throw off. The society had claims upon them, and the weight of their family's influence would tell in the upward and downward scale. Ultimately thinking through, are you able to make rational decisions? And then also, should you even have kids? Is it too late in the time for kids? Mark 13:17. Woe unto them that are a child and them that give suck in these days. Ultimately warns against mothers that have to care for children during the time of trouble. So again, discuss the illness in your family history. Even if it's wise to have children, what influence on your family will they have over their marriage? Oftentimes you're not just marrying them, but also their family. And do you agree on the timeline and the generation that you live in? Remember to be careful what you pray for. And this is something interesting because if you have somebody in mind, I really, really want, Mr. Dreamy, and you're praying, God, give me Mr. Dreamy. If you're doing that, God will actually give you what you ask for. And so make sure you're asking if it's your will. And say, God, I release you from anything that I've asked that is of my own lusts, and I only ask for things that are within your will, and I ask that you show me any kind of blockers or anything that's slowing down your will from being done. Again, after going through all this, figure out, are there any potential hurdles identified, any hurdles you need to overcome? It's okay to pray that God winds down a relationship gently and undoes maybe the steps that you've taken that were not fully on his ground. If it's not his will, it's better that you go back to being single in God's perfect will than continue forward and married in God's permissible will that will bring trouble later on. So again, it's this concept of identifying some hurdles that you're going to have, identifying triggers, share with each other ultimately what your self-awareness exercises, what you learn from them, and find out what trauma and past that they're not healed from yet. So the same exercises you did, now do for them, right? Have them go through, identify what their vices are, where are the areas that you'll need to be praying for them to help them overcome, figure out where that's all at, and then figure out, is this something you're willing to take on? Remember, just because somebody has maybe a rough past doesn't mean it's part of their future, right? God only sees our future, not our past. But be clear that, they are firmly committed to Jesus at all cost, and be clear what's in the past and what is still lingering that you need to be aware of and be praying for God to intervene on. 2 Corinthians 1:4, we should be comforting our partners, right? So we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble. It's not this idea that we have to find somebody who's perfect. Just knowing that you have to find somebody who is desiring to be perfect. If everything checks out and you've prayed and God's led, then the question is, how fast should we move forward? Right? How fast can you move into marriage? And the answer is, in message to young people, the Spirit of Prophecy says, when the sacred nature and claims of marriage are understood, it will even now be approved in heaven. So this is saying that there is no timeline. If it's fully understood, then it's okay to proceed. But again, you have to go through the steps. You have to make sure God is leading. And if God is leading, then it's not like we'll have to wait 3 years, or have to wait 8 years, or 1 year, whatever it is. No, it's you're approved to move forward if you're approved to move forward. The statement is not a license to rush in, right? We shouldn't just say, okay, great. He says I can move forward. Let's just move forward and hastily. Okay. There's in the Patriarchs and Prophets, chapter 17, we talk about how in the early times, custom required the customs of the day, right, required the bridegroom before the ratification of marriage engagement to pay a sum of money or its equivalent in property, according to the circumstances, to the father of the wife. This is regarded as a safeguard to the marriage relation. Fathers did not think it safe to trust the happiness of their daughters to men who had not made provisions for the support of a family. If they had not sufficient thrift and energy to manage a business and acquire cattle or lands, it was feared that the life would provide worthless. But provision was made to test those who had nothing to pay for a wife. They were permitted to labor for the father whose daughter they loved, the length of the time being regulated by the value of the dowry required. When the suitor was found faithful of his service and provided and proved in other aspects worthy, he obtained the daughter as his wife. Generally, the dowry which the father had received was given to her at the marriage. And in both cases of Rachel and Leah, however, Laban selfishly retained the dowry that should have been given to them. They referred to this when they said, he has sold us and devoured our money. But the big picture here is this. When the suitor was required to render service to secure a bride, a hasty marriage was prevented, and there was opportunity to test the depth of his affections, as well as his ability to provide for a family. So far everyday life is concerned, they are virtually strangers when they unite their interests at the altar. And so this is kind of an interesting takeaway here, right, of preventing hasty marriages and thinking through, can this person ultimately support you, or are you in a position to support that person? The next is, before getting married, again, thinking through this engagement period, making sure that everything is aligned, and this is going to be forming better habits. Okay, so what are the habits that you bring into a marriage, and use the opportunity before living together to purge away the behaviors that are not going to bring you closer to God. And this starts with diet. It is difficult and often well nigh impossible for one who is intemperate in diet to exercise patience and self-control. Meat excites and strengthens the lower passions. The less feverish the diet, the more easily can the passions be controlled. So if you are on a meat diet, if you're eating things that are very rich, and it actually excites the animal instincts, as they're called, inside of you, right? And so this is going to make it harder for you to, maintain boundaries during courtship, as well as, in the marriage itself. So highly recommend, and this is such a small thing, you could go on, I have a whole course just on health and happiness, but the important thing is understanding really the connection between diet and passion. So the question becomes, are you going in with a clear mind, right? Are you able to think clearly and make good decisions? And how is your lifestyle impacting your mental state? And some ways to kind of maintain clarity are simple stuff like having a tidy environment, not having a cluttered desk, not having a cluttered mind, right? Avoiding TV and music, which are going to hypnotize or distract or give you chaos. Surround yourself with plants and nature. The color green is very healing. And most importantly, go to God and pray for wisdom and clarity, because God will give you wisdom and clarity. Next, immerse yourself in nature. And even if it just means houseplants, right? They give off oxygen or calming. Take a break every hour or so and stretch, have deep breaths, then start walking every day, right? Remember that, again, positivity is a choice. We cannot control our circumstances. However, we can control our outlook. I love this concept. A pessimist is half empty, an optimist is half full, and a psalmist is overflowing. When I saw that, I thought that was brilliant, right? Again, it's about how you perceive things. And those that are asked if they believe that there's more positivity in the world than negativity, The group that watches the news all day will answer negativity, whereas the group who spends time in nature and gardening or outdoors will answer there's more positivity than negativity in the world. Ultimately, it's this idea of where you focus your mind, that's what your reality becomes. A little statement, optimists are right, so are pessimists. So it's up to you to choose who you want to be. And a merry heart doth good like a medicine, but broken spirit drieth the bones, right? It'll even impact your health, your mindset will. Where are we drawing from? And thinking through this idea that what is the source of our positivity? Does it come from us, who we surround ourselves with? Is it something higher than ourselves? Like, where are we connecting into? And again, going back to perception, it's if we decide that there's a more positivity in the world, right? One group that's looking at the TV all day is going to say, well, we're doomed, and those that are just like looking into nature are going to say, oh, life is good. Again, it's about what you're connecting into, and there's a kind of Mark Twain, wrote, those who read newspapers are uninformed and who don't, and those who do read newspapers are misinformed. George Orwell, 1984, the party that told you to reject the evidence in your own eyes was their final, most essential command. Is this whole concept of the deceiver is using the media to ultimately drive us crazy. And if we are consumed by that and feed from that, we will be crazy, right? It's this consumption that changes our perception. We understand the idea that what we eat impacts our physical body. So we should also understand that what we consume with our eyes and ears impacts our mental state. And this is backed up in the Bible. I'm paraphrasing a little of 2 Corinthians 3:18, but what we put into our body becomes our body. And so we need to not consume poison through our mouth in the form of coffee, sugar, or other drugs. We need to also not consume poison through our eyes and ears in the form of TV, music, gossiping, etc. I found personally that by eliminating toxins such as drugs, alcohol, etc., stimulants like coffee, even sugar, I've had a much more even mood and been able to eliminate all the background noises like TV or media. My brain was far clearer, and my mind was much more free to elevate versus being hypnotized, right? I believe that eliminating sugar and dairy is a way to not only lose weight but also feel clearer and better. We need to be thinking about what we're allowing into our bodies and also finding partners that have the same understanding of what they want to bring in. We must protect ourselves against negative sights and sounds. If we are living with somebody and they're not aligned with this, we're ultimately going to be have pollution into our body that we don't really want to have. So we can, Ellen White says that we can get a good way out of the world if we choose to do so. Right? We can avoid seeing many of the evils that are multiplying so fast in these last days. We can avoid hearing much about the wickedness and crime that exists. So we're called to not consume that the world is putting out. By watching or reading about crime, it says that we break down the barriers of law and self-restraint. Okay? So if we understand what we're consuming again, right? It reads here that I feel alarmed as I witness everywhere the frivolity of young men and young women who profess to believe the truth. God does not seem to be in their thoughts. Their thoughts are filled with nonsense, and their conversation is only empty, vain talk. We are called in Philippians 4:8 to, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, if there be any praise, if there be any virtue, think on these things, right? We are only to be thinking and focusing and magnifying that which is good, that which is of God, and completely shutting out all the negativity. Now, this doesn't mean that we live in a state of not of reality, right? I personally believe that it's important to understand the signs of the times that are happening around us. But if we get caught up into them and invested into politics and things like this, it's only going to eat away at us. It is both the law of intellectual and the spiritual nature that by beholding we become changed. The mind gradually adapts itself to the subjects upon which it is allowed to dwell, and it becomes assimilated to that which it is accustomed to live and reverence. Colossians 3, 1-2. Set your minds on things above, not on things of the earth. So the takeaway here is to form healthy habits before marriage and ensure both of you agree to these long term, to avoid negativity, avoid consuming media that'll hypnotize or pervert our senses, and really just ultimately seek to do things that are in alignment with the glory of God. So once you have all this, I believe that that's something that says, okay, now you're potentially ready for marriage, and then there's a few little warnings after marriage. And I'm not going to go too much more into after marriage, but I'll just leave it at this, is we're called to avoid excess. God requires us to control our lives from excess. And we're told what this means. It means we are warned not to allow the animal instinct to predominate over the intellectual and the moral. We are under solemn obligation to God to keep a pure spirit and a healthy body, that we may benefit to humanity and render unto God a perfect service. The more animal passions are indulged, the stronger they become. Many a woman has had her fine and tender sensibilities outraged because the marriage relation allowed him whom she called husband to be brutal in his treatment of her. The bedchamber where the angels of God should preside is made unholy by unholy practices. And because these shameful animalism rules, bodies are corrupted, loathsome practices lead to loathsome diseases, and God has given us a blessing that is made a curse. Husbands should be careful, attentive, constant, faithful, and compassionate. They should manifest love and sympathy, and if they fulfill the words of Christ, their love will not be of a base, earthly, or sensual character, and it will lead to the destruction of their own bodies and bring upon their wives debility and disease. They will not indulge in the gratification of base passions while ringing in the ears of their wife that they must be subject to the husband to everything. So this is a reproof against any man who uses that comment, women subject themselves to the husband, as a way to exploit what their desires are. It is not pure, holy love which leads the wife to gratify the animal propensities of her husband. It may be necessary to humbly and affectionately urge, even at the risk of his displeasure, that she cannot debase her body by yielding to sexual excess. Sexual excess will effectually destroy a love for devotional exercises. Let the Christian wife refrain, both in word and act, from exciting the animal passions of her husband. Self-denial and temperance should be the watchword for their married life. So again here, this is just this setting expectations even before going to marriage, that you pray with your partner and discuss ways to prevent perversion and potential moral traps. Read God's guidance on self-control, and ultimately talk with your partner and see, discuss what implications that sexual activity has on the loud cry and the 144,000. There is potentially some, there ultimately has to look to God and see what is God's will. And if we are so consumed with the lust of this flesh, how can we actually reach a higher state? We read that there's a spiritual and a physical body. And if we want to access the spiritual body, we have to be cautious how involved we are in the physical body. So ultimately, that's kind of that in a nutshell. I hope that some of these verses were helpful. Obviously, with all of this, it's important to just go to God with this. Have Him help you understand if it is in His will that you are married, if it is in your will that, ultimately what your mission is. And just make sure that you don't align yourself with somebody who is going to keep you from God or keep you from your mission. I believe through my studies of the spirit of prophecy in the Bible, that's the only clause on should you get married or shouldn't you get married is, what's the implication? Will it distract you? Will it pull you away from God? Or do you think that God has aligned you with or placed somebody in your life that you feel that has the same mission that you have, has the same values and the same desire to continue to improve up until the point where we allow Christ to finish the work that he started in us? And so my prayer for each of you is that you go to God with all things, surrender all things, and don't allow anyone in this world to get between us and God. So with that, thanks for joining me on this, and I hope to see you in other courses. Bye now.